Next panel, please welcome David Nahai, partner at Lewis, Brisbois, Bisgaard and Smith.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. How are you all doing? How are you all doing? All right. God, get a bit of life out there. So listen, before we start, please join me in a round of applause for the LABC team, for Mary Leslie, Nadine Watt, Brad Cox, all of the staff members who've done it yet again with another wonderful conference. Look, I don't want to name the city. I don't want to name the city out of respect for the victims of the hurricane. But the recent hurricane showed what can happen when a city adopts a laissez-faire attitude, approach toward zoning and development. Here in California, here in Los Angeles, we've long recognized that growth has to be managed wisely, carefully, sustainably, because we live in a fragile environment. But we could have done better, and we should do better. The truth is that we must build, we must develop. Otherwise, what is now a very serious housing crisis will soon balloon into a housing catastrophe. This year, Governor Brown and the California legislature stepped up to tackle the housing crisis throughout the state. On September 29th, barely a month ago, over a dozen bills were signed into law by the governor in order to try to address the housing crisis that we're living in the midst of. These bills try to tackle various aspects of the problem, from funding to dealing with low-income issues. But an important piece in this tapestry of laws is SB 35, which seeks to streamline the permitting process in certain locations and under certain circumstances. Now, SB 35 is remarkable in a bunch of ways. For a start, because it actually streamlines permitting. And you would have thought that my community, the environmental community, would have opposed it. But that didn't happen. It was supported by the enviros, it was supported by the business community, supported by the unions. So support for this bill across a wide spectrum of stakeholders. It's also remarkable because it is the product of the incredible work of a freshman senator, Senator Scott Wiener. And let's give him a round of applause before I give him the introduction. Senator Wiener was elected just in 2016 to represent California's 11th district in the Bay Area. In the Senate, he's already worked on legislation to make housing more affordable, as we've discussed, to improve the reliability and capacity of public transportation support, to fight against climate change, to expand and safeguard the rights of communities, including the LGBT community. Prior to his election, he served as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, where he authored a number of first-in-the-nation laws on a variety of issues. One such issue was authoring and passing a ballot measure, which increased funding for San Francisco's railroad, light rail and bus system. He represented San Francisco on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District, the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, and he served as the chair of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. Today, he's going to speak to us about the California State Legislature's package of housing bills, which I mentioned briefly earlier on, and especially his law, SB 35. Please welcome Senator Wiener.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction. Are we still morning? Good morning, everyone. Almost afternoon. First of all, I want to thank the LA Business Council and UCLA for having me here today and for hosting this forum. I have to say, I'm a San Francisco person, and we in San Francisco sometimes get a little bit caught up in our own existence and sometimes forget that there's a much bigger state and world out there. And one of the great things about being in the state Senate is I am getting to know other parts of the state much better. And having spent some time this year in LA, I've just been really impressed by the LA Business Council and by UCLA for continually raising these issues. It's been just terrific to see a city that understands that we have a crisis and that we need to do something about it. And I do believe that the politics of housing in California are completely flipping. I was first elected to office in November 2010 when I was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. And, in San Francisco, we're a city and a county, so Board of Supervisors is also basically the city council. Taking office in January 2011, things were a little different. San Francisco had always been expensive. Housing was always an issue in San Francisco, certainly not like it is today. But we still, in my first few years of office, it was very, very hard politically to be pro-housing. Very hard. Fights about everything. Even projects that, looking back on it, you're like, how can anyone ever have opposed that project? But it was constantly a fight. And you were almost a little bit embarrassed to say that you were pro-housing, because someone was just going to say, oh, you're just a shill for developers, for those greedy developers. And in a period of about 5 years, I think everything flipped. And a crisis will do that. When the average rent in San Francisco is $3,500 a month for a one-bedroom, when we have just the hollowing out of our middle class in some areas because people just can't afford to live, when we have SROs that were always for people who would otherwise have been homeless and were living on disability check that are now being occupied by retail workers and waiters and waitresses because they can't afford traditional apartments, so we see a spike in homelessness. It'll do something. It'll make a change, and I think we have seen that. And it's to the point where my opponent in my state Senate race, we were colleagues on the Board of Supervisors, and in 2012, we had a very controversial project called Park Merced, 6,000 new units of housing, transit-oriented. It's a great project in so many ways. It was World War III in San Francisco. I supported it, she opposed it. At the time, I got the heck beat out of me for years for supporting that project. By the time our race came around, I was the one on the offense saying she didn't support 6,000 units of housing, and it worked. The politics had flipped. And so coming to the state Senate, where I knew I wanted to do housing, but I also knew that historically the state had not been that involved in housing. It was local control with a few state laws that were never enforced. So when I, on my first day, introduced SB 35 to do streamlining, this was right after the governor's streamlining proposal had not succeeded. And we decided we were going to take another run at it. And we looked at all the opposition to the governor's plan, and we tried to address different concerns, introduced a bill, and I really thought this is going to be a statement bill. It's going to take me 5 years to build towards a victory on this bill. I was not confident at all that we were going to be able to do it in the first year. And as I started talking to my colleagues in the legislature, I realized that I was more optimistic. That colleagues from inland areas where I didn't think housing was really an issue would immediately start talking about how kids were unable to buy homes or rent in the communities where they grew up, in areas that have traditionally been affordable. Colleagues who I thought, this person 100% is going to oppose my bill. There's no way he's ever going to support it, immediately supporting it. Because the elected officials are seeing every day. And then after we introduced it, every time I was anywhere in the state where I was walking into a room with local elected officials, with city council members, I would be really fearful. I was going to walk in and they were going to get up in my face and be like, why are you trying to take some local control away? Never happened once. I'm not saying they all supported it. Never happened. And I cannot tell you how many times a city council member came up to me and said, you know what, I can't be public about this, but thank you for what you're doing. I'm sick of having to struggle with projects that I know are good because my constituents don't want it in their neighborhood. So that created a real opportunity this year with the housing package. And I'm really proud of the work that the legislature has been able to do, and the governor. It was a team effort. The leadership of both houses, the governor, there were so many people who made this possible. And so SB 35 is a pretty simple notion that we have RHNA, we have the Regional Housing Needs Assessment that has never had teeth. We go through this dramatic process every 8 years to come up with these numbers. I went through it when I was in local government, and then it sits on a shelf and collects dust. And you have some communities that take it seriously, some communities that ignore it. And SB 35 puts some teeth into RHNA by saying that if you are meeting your RHNA goals, Godspeed, do your thing. If you're not meeting your RHNA goals, you're streamlined. And streamlining means that if someone proposes a project, whether it's affordable housing or market rate project, that is within your zoning, it's a ministerial permit. It's an over-the-counter permit. No CEQA, no conditional use, no discretionary review, no discretionary approvals whatsoever. You have 3 to 6 months, depending on the size of the project, to issue that, to do design review, and that's it. So I think it's a big step forward. You'll hear a discussion about prevailing wage, which was part of the discussion, and we can talk about the pros and cons of that. But I think this was a big step, and we were able to work with the environmental community on it. The rest of the package was also incredibly important. The state has finally acknowledged that it has a big role to play in funding affordable housing, and that is really important, particularly for communities that aren't wealthy and don't have their own local budgets to build affordable housing. We cracked down on gaming of the general plan, where communities would identify sites for housing with no intention of ever building sites there. We put teeth into the Housing Accountability Act so that arbitrary downzonings, arbitrary denials of projects will now create accountability. So it was a big, big step. With that said, we have a lot more work to do. And in the coming years, we can't just say we checked the box on housing. We have to keep going. We're going to keep going next year and the year after that and the year after that. And we have to keep the momentum. And we rely on you and our community partners to hold elected officials accountable to say you can't stop because we have a crisis on our hands. So I look forward to the panel today. And again, thank you for having me.
Please welcome our next panel and moderator, Richard Katz.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's one person who clapped. Thank you, too. I want to welcome you today. We're going to go through the panel, and we have some questions we want to ask and stimulate a discussion. I'm not going to take your time now to read their bios because it's in the books you have, and that gives us a little more time to have discussion here. The panel, Smart Growth and Equity in an Expanding Economy. And I guess we could discuss expanding for who, but that's a different panel. So we'll just stay within the confines of the housing piece. But a couple of the things that I've noticed, I think we've all experienced over the years. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of boxes checked, Senator, and we still keep coming back, and we still have the gap, and we still have the questions, and we still have the problem. Which is not to mean that there's not a lot of really good people who have tried to really do good things, but I think all of us understand that increasing the minimum wage $5 an hour over 5 years is not going to get anybody out of poverty. And in that same sense, subsidizing housing, while it's good and we need subsidized housing, is not going to house all the people that need housing. The lack of wage growth is part of the problem. The demographics are part of the problem, the land cost, and of course, it's LA. Where if you don't have $1 billion, don't think about coming downtown to do anything. So against that backdrop, I'm looking forward to all of your solutions now in terms of the affordable housing
Optimistic
piece.
start to the panel, Richard. Thank you.
Well, well, Jacob, we're going to take you up on that. One last thought, because I thought it was fascinating. I just completed 4 years on the Planning Commission. I appreciate the mayor having made that appointment, and I equally appreciate him respecting my request not to be reappointed. One of my last hearings, though, we approved the Lucas Museum in downtown Los Angeles, in the sports complex by the Coliseum, which is going to be phenomenal. And he brought his own $1 billion, Jacob, for that project. But we asked the question, why LA? A lot of competition. The Bay Area, Chicago, Seattle, there were a lot of competition. And he gave an answer that I've never had heard before in the 4 years of sitting on that planning commission, which was, we could build it faster here. Yeah, and our reaction was about the same as yours. It's like, I'm sorry, we're talking about my city here, LA? And it was just, which either means that the people who were pushing Measure S were right, or that, that it was just a convergence of all good things coming together for a good project that was financed, et cetera. But against that backdrop, some things can get built. How do we deal with this problem, though, which is so multifaceted? And we're going to talk about it from a housing standpoint, but one of the things we have to remember, we all get stuck in silos. And homelessness, lack of affordable housing crosses every silo. And yet we tend not to address the problem that way. And I think that's one of the things we need to do a better job, all of us. And I know a lot of people are trying. But with that, I'm going to start off with Darren, who is not Hasan. And we're very pleased Darren's here on behalf of SCAG. But Darren, talk to us a bit about the senator's bill. We were talking earlier about SCAG has a regional responsibility, as everyone in this room knows, for everything. I mean, I guess that's where all the silos come together, is at SCAG to some extent. Right. How do you all see the problem? Where are we in terms of the numbers? What's the data show about where we are today in 2017?
Yeah, the numbers aren't good. Well, we can start there easily, and there's some numbers up on your screen that help to articulate that. And we'll talk through it a little bit. But as Richard said, and thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the senator for really setting the stage, because certainly what happened in a very quick amount of time in SB 32 is very impressive, and certainly is going to have an impact. A little bit about SCAG too. We are the Metropolitan Planning Organization and the Council of Governments. 191 cities we represent in 6 counties. That's about 19 million people, 38,000 square miles. We're also governed by a board of local elected officials, and one of our past presidents, Cheryl Vegas Walker's in the audience today, and that's important because that's who sets policy for our organization. A bill like SB 35 certainly is staff we looked at, we were excited by, based on some of the numbers we were looking at, presented it to them, and there was still this conflict at local government about what's the role and responsibility of the state and what's the role and responsibility at the local jurisdiction. And even though I think many of the members on our board really were excited by that opportunity, they just weren't quite ready to release some of those local controllability. But when we looked at it from a staff perspective and from a regional perspective, the same way that I know the senator looked at it when you go back to 1980 to 2010, it's been about on average 30,000 unit deficit in LA County alone. You add that up to where we are today, that's as high as $1 million household units or housing units that have not been built, that shouldn't have been built. When you think about how that relates, and you see the numbers up there to housing stock total, you're talking about a 10% deficit. When you go forward and you see the numbers that talk about households from today moving forward, there's a 700,000 increase in household units expected. So the growth isn't going to stop. The needs are there, and we're starting from not just zero, but negative almost 900,000 to close to 1 million. So the challenges are real. I think you heard in the last panel talk about the transportation infrastructure that the county is building, and I certainly think there is a blueprint there as to how some of the housing can be built around that, but that certainly is not going to be enough. We're not in a situation where it can just be targeted. We've got to think about all different types of housing units. When it comes to affordable housing units, certainly that's another responsibility that SCAG holds. We get the pleasure, as we like to say, of working with our member jurisdictions to identifying how many affordable housing units need to be built in each one of their cities. And that's one of the tools that the senator was looking to use in his bill. So imagine us as a membership organization We have to go, and the state has charged us with no additional resources to go work with our member jurisdictions and identify how many affordable housing units need to be built in each one of those cities. We need to adopt and send them back that number and then track to some degree how they're going about doing it. As was referenced briefly, while that process has been going on, we've done it 4 times over the past 25 years. Now it's currently at an 8-year increment, and we're starting that cycle again now. There has not been a lot of teeth or incentives, I should say, for cities to do that. Certainly, one of the major tool that our membership used on redevelopment to bring those units to market is no longer there. The last plan that we did was in 2007. Certainly, maybe a similar economic time to we are now, but when we looked into what happened after that, where the region lost 1 million jobs in a matter of about 2 years, certainly the impacts of bringing those new units to bear just didn't happen. So big picture, we're at least $1 million short today. I mean, 1 million units short. I wish it was only $1 million, and it's going to, at least double in the next decade or two. Absolutely.
Personally. But go on. So your total LA numbers, LA County specifically, the cumulative effect?
The cumulative effect of the last 30 years of underproduction is 900,000 units.
900 in LA County.
Yes.
It's right. Inconceivable how to
No.
how to grapple with a number that big, particularly when you hear stories like the news report a couple of weeks ago that a significant number of Americans can't put $400 together cash in 2 or 3 days if they had to. So you have the 900,000 deficit already, and then you have on top of that the people who are just one incident, one accident, one health issue, one job loss away from sliding right there, which numbers are probably far greater than the 900,000. From a SCAG perspective, because I know you have a regional responsibility, some areas better than others, or is it, I'm sure some cities are better than other cities. The senator wouldn't have had to do the bill he did.
Right.
But how do you see it in LA County?
Overall, only about maybe 20 cities of the 88 cities in LA County have met their basic housing needs. So that leaves,
Is that a city like Vernon that has no housing? Or
Industry certainly is one of them. Where they get a target. Vernon's one of them.
Apologies to anybody from Vernon.
But there are some like West Hollywood and others that have certainly been very diligent and gone above and beyond what their housing need is. Certainly the city of LA has been very ambitious in that. But what that means is there's 60 plus cities that are in a situation where they have not met the basic housing needs as was identified in the last housing assessment. And that certainly sets up for why the senator put his bill in and what kind of incentives can be put in so developers have a greater opportunity to provide what has been identified as being needed for a decade now.
So I appreciate that, Darren. Before I ask the senator a question, just one point, just to go back to what we were saying earlier. One of the reasons freeways and buses and trains and et cetera are so congested in LA is exactly the crisis you talked about. There is no real jobs housing balance unless, in LA County. There are 8 to 10 jobs more on the west side than there is every piece of housing available. And so that just goes back to that point of all these silos being interrelated and getting past that. A huge step, Senator, congratulations on your bill this year. No small task. In some ways people say as hard as that was, now the hard work begins. How do you get HCD to make sure that they do not what they think you were writing, but what you thought you were writing or you knew you were writing? And from an enforcement standpoint, incentive point, how do we now make sure, how do we make sure that it happens? And second, what were you unable to get in the bill this year that you'd like to have and come back with that we could possibly help with in the future?
Sure, and congratulations on the Lucas Museum. The first effort was in San Francisco, and we, in our very San Francisco way, made it really hard for them. And
is that going to cost us water?
Well, I don't know that the tunnels are happening, so it might. First, in terms of HCD, we worked hand in glove with HCD for a long time. The governor. He doesn't take positions on bills until very late in the game, but his staff, we worked with them early on. We wanted to make sure that the bill was something that they were supportive of. And HCD in particular provided us with a lot of technical help and, again, wanting to make sure that it's something that they could administer and all that. And so HCD they started working on implementation before the bill was signed. Like there was no lackadaisical approach here. They want to get this implemented as quickly as possible. I know the people who are working on it. They're super enthusiastic about the bill. So I'm confident that HCD will implement this well.
And the tools HCD has at their disposal?
Well, HCD will be certifying which cities are streamlined and at what income levels. And so they'll be the ones to make that determination. In addition, SB 35 for the first time will require every city and county in the state of California to report every year on their housing production. Currently, only general law cities are required to report to the state. Charter cities are not required at all, and of course those are the mid-sized to larger cities. And even general law cities, there's no enforcement. So under SB 35, every city has to report every year, and if you skip it, if you don't report 2 years in a row, you're streamlined. You're deemed not to be meeting it. So there is now an incentive for communities to report. So NHCD will have that enforcement obligation as well.
I want you to describe, because I think that's obviously the key feature of the bill and something a lot of people thought you could never get past, the streamlined provision in there. And as you're answering that, could you also answer, if I'm a developer, wouldn't I want to look for a streamlined city because of the advantages you're now going to describe?
I think that fundamentally developers, the process, there are various barriers to development, including cost of land and demand and all that, or potential barriers. And process is just one of them. I'm not concerned that developers will say, oh, this is a streamlined city, this isn't, so we're going to just do all of our work here. I think there's so many other factors that go into where you want to develop and where is an appropriate site, and so forth. I guess in a close case, yes, the streamlining, could tip it, but I don't see that as a huge.
You don't think CEQA, no CEQA, that's pretty good incentive, I would think.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is a good incentive, and I think that I just think it's going to be so variable because cities vary so much, and there are just a lot of factors. But the underlying premise of SB 35 is, and I called it teeth, putting teeth in the arena. I should stop using that because sometimes the League of Cities, when they would oppose the bill, saying, you're just trying to punish cities. It's not punishment. Having enough housing is a benefit, it's not punishment. And so, and so what the bill, basically the philosophy is, if you're not building enough housing, we're just gonna help you build your housing. And so if that means that some projects shift over into the cities that are really falling short and that have the most severe shortage, I'm not going to cry over that.
If you could just, for the folks in the audience that are not familiar with SB 35, just talk about the incentives, because I know Kevin wants to take notes on that, and Brad wants to take notes. So there are a couple people up here who want to take notes while you're talking about the incentives that are, what streamlining means as of January 1st.
Yeah, so what it'll mean is that if you are, so it's RENA is typically, not for every city, but mostly an 8-year cycle. And so because we'll now have all these annual reports, so 4 years into the cycle, and then at the end of the cycle, so every 4 years, you'll be evaluated. Did you meet your market rate? Did you meet your all the below market rate categories? And so you can be, and it's streamlined, it's by income category. So if you're meeting your market rate but not below market rate, you'll be streamlined in below market rate but not market rate. Almost no city, very few meet their below market rate. So
if you're out of compliance in one of the categories.
Right. So if you're meeting your market rate but you're not meeting your low income, you're streamlined in low income but not market rate. So almost the entire state of California will be streamlined for all below market rate categories because there are only a handful of small cities that can build 1 or 2 projects and they meet their. So there's a reason why the affordable housing developer community was so enthusiastically supportive. If they are proposing a BMR, a below market rate project that's within zoning, no CEQA, no conditional use, no discretionary reviews. It's just ministerial as long as it's within zoning. And that's really what streamlining is. Takes it out of CEQA entirely, and you can't have any kind of conditional use or discretion. It's all ministerial, over the counter, with some design. And the design review that you have 3 to 6 months to do has to be based on objective design criteria. I've seen every trick in the book as a local elected official, and one of them is we're just going to do endless design review. I was involved in projects in my old supervisor district where you would have 50 community meetings. And even when they weren't complaining about the number of units, it was about the design over. And so there are smaller communities that don't have objective design standards. The state needs to help these communities adopt objective designs. We want good architecture. And so we should be providing that technical and financial support to help communities get these design standards. And then if it's a streamlined project, you pay for up to 10 units, there's no prevailing wage required. Once you hit 11 units, prevailing wage is required if a developer chooses to do the streamlining, and they can opt in or opt out. And then at higher levels, for market rate housing, not for below market rate, skilled workforce requirements come in. So it's important for people who have concerns about prevailing wage, because I totally acknowledge there are some projects in some communities where it works, some where it doesn't work. I totally acknowledge that. But there are many projects in California, first of all, that are up to 10 units, no prevailing wage whatsoever. And then skilled workforce doesn't kick into a higher level, and it never kicks in for 100% affordable housing.
Wow, impressive. Congratulations. And obviously benefiting from your having been in local government first, because you can sit there. No, we know those tricks. I was part of the group. I watched those tricks, and hopefully this will level that playing field. Kevin, what do you think? I mean, Kevin has had a good day so far. You're talking earlier, got approved for a project in San Francisco that only took 7 years. And
it's a good project.
And it's a good project.
And no lawsuit.
And no lawsuits. And at the risk of let's just continue the good day. So how does what Scott's done impact what you guys are doing at Forest City? You're a large provider, been in California for a long time, and we're glad. How does this help?
Well, obviously streamlining and getting rid of CEQA for any project is a huge, huge benefit to us. The one thing that a developer wants more than anything else is surety, right? So when I start a project, if you tell me it's going to take me 5 years or 7 years or whatever, I can plan for that, right? I can spend my money, I can option the land, there are other things I can do. But if you say, well, I don't know how long it's going to take, and you have to jump through all these hoops, and then there might be a lawsuit that could take 10 years, and then I don't know, and that makes me very hesitant. That makes me want to take my capital somewhere else where I could have more surety. Sure. So things like streamlining, as it's described in 35, I think is fantastic.
Certitude is what you're looking for.
Certitude, of course. It's like I want to know what I have to do and when I have to do it, right? I am curious, though, wouldn't a city want to be streamlined? I mean, isn't that a benefit to them?
I'll take the negative mark, but I get streamlining at the same time.
Exactly. So anyway. So I think that yes, streamlining would be a good thing. I mean, production, as I think was clearly defined, production is a huge problem, and we're not going to be able to build our way out of the problem, but we got to give it as good a shot as we can, and it needs to happen at all levels. So anything that can remove roadblocks and give us surety about where we want to go and how we can spend our money in order to produce as much housing as we can is all good stuff.
Other than the lack of certitude, is CEQA the major problem from a developer standpoint?
I mean, it's
applied, rather.
It's probably top of the list,
yeah.
But there's certainly 2, 3, 4, and 5 below it that make things difficult, and that changes by jurisdiction. Some places have very active community groups, San Francisco being one of them. But I generally know who they are, right? So I know where my fight's going to come from. I know that I need to go talk to them. I know that I need to engage them. I know that I need to work hard to involve them in the process, right? So that it's not, a developer going into a smoky back room and finishing the deal, right? That's not the process anymore. It just doesn't work anymore. You have to engage. You have to be part of the community. You have to go and talk to the community about what their needs are and try to meet their needs and have a dialogue about it. But there I know what I've got, right? Here in Los Angeles, you know, you're not quite sure where the fight's going to come from. It could come from anywhere, and it's always hand-to-hand combat. And I do think that is coming down. I do think that is defining itself a little bit more here in LA, but it's still very, very difficult here from that perspective. So if I can say I don't have to deal with CEQA, then obviously that takes that off the table, takes a lawsuit off the table, which is a huge unknown, which happens all the way at the end, which is another part of the problem.
No, it's civic engagement has, the Bay Area probably leads the state, but LA is not far behind when it comes to transportation development, housing, et cetera. I used to say, when doing transportation, I support mass transit. Everyone in LA supports mass transit, so you use it to get out of my way on the freeway.
Exactly.
You know, and then I'll let you build a transit location that's convenient to me, which I define as 2 blocks from my house. But I don't want you to build it in my backyard, which I define as 4 blocks from my house. So now go ahead and do it. So and that translates into the housing crisis as well. Robin, you and Abode have been doing this for a while in the affordable housing space. You've been successful where others haven't. Your secret, or do you want to? We were talking earlier about you never find secrets out of things like this. But what can you share, and how is this going to impact what you're doing? Scott's great work.
If I have any secrets, but it's hard work, and as Kevin alluded to, there are so many barriers that cause delays, increase costs, sometimes kills projects to make it happen. But I think bills like the streamlining bill is incredibly important to the production of affordable housing. I think from our standpoint, as was already indicated, there are very few cities that actually meet their below market or affordable level of housing production. So to have a bill like this in place means that you can go to XY city that you've been trying to get affordable housing built and have the streamlining opportunity available to you, which I think that is a number of cities where it will be effective. I think the other challenge is, because it does require that the cities actually have the zoning in place, is how do we get over that barrier? And I think that's the next step, is just making sure that localities have the zoning in place. But I think this will be a very effective tool at meeting that gap of affordability and producing housing throughout the state. And I can think of a number of cities just here in LA County who just can never meet it. If we can go in with a project that has the zoning in place and we're using the density bonus on the parking and all those other elements, it'll definitely help to increase production.
As David Nahai alluded to earlier, Houston was always referred to as LA without zoning, and so we know what happens when you don't have zoning. But also, as we heard earlier from I'm getting too old to remember names now, but from the planning department, some of those dates for when some of those plans were last updated. I mean, and the planning department's going through this Recode LA process. It's going to take 5 years. I don't know about you guys, but anything that's got a 5-year horizon in my world doesn't work, because by the time you get done, you got to start over again, or it's out of date. Particularly given how quickly change is happening now. How do you manage to go ahead and still, you're very successful, but you also, it's not just affordable, it's affordable and sustainable are the 2 key words in all your projects.
Yeah, so, we have been willing to, when I think about the work that we do, especially our TOD work and gentrifying neighborhoods and bringing not just sustainability to the physical built product that we're producing, which we're very committed to doing that, but it's actually how we're doing our work and where we're siting our projects. And we are willing to take the risk of going out and inquiring opportunities that require some type of land use approval. We have a project that we're working on in South Los Angeles right now that is under construction. We went from a density of 48 units to 140 units. And the way we were able to do that, it's transit. It's right across the street from the expo site, very close to the Lucas event. It is, but we engage the community, and we engage the community around principles of sustainability and what it meant to do things like build affordable housing versus building parking, what it meant to bring healthcare, because it has a healthcare component to it. All of those things became important for us to ultimately get to the Planning Commission, with a great project that increased density, reduced parking, brought a beautiful, sustainable building to the community.
How much of a problem or an issue is parking, particularly in affordable? You highlighted the transit stop at Expo. Obviously, LA may be late to the transit game, but we're catching up fast. We've got more stuff under construction anywhere in the country. But how does that impact on your clients in particular?
Sure. I mean, as an affordable housing developer, we're able to benefit from other state legislation around parking reduction. And that is an incredible benefit. So I think we're looking at a couple of developments right now where we're parking half a space per unit. But that doesn't discourage or dissuade the community from coming out and opposing it and really talking about the parking associated with it. So we still have to go through that process of engaging the community around the parking issue. And we're able to point to studies where we've built parking and it's become the tricycle space for the kids to ride their bike as opposed to cars parking in it because the car ratio to household is so incredibly low. But it still is a process of engaging the community around this reduction in parking. And there's still some localities that, even though it's there on the books, they still have their requirements, and we constantly have to battle that.
Maybe as we're going through this, and we'll come back also to the folks who have already spoken, but the notion of should there be a set limit, a minimum or a maximum on parking, or should we leave that to the developer knowing who their clientele is and what the market's going to bear? And people get all nervous when you say that, because some neighborhoods like projects to be built that are overparked because they can't park on the street right now. So you get, and then other people think that you ought to eliminate parking altogether to force people to do something different. So any thoughts on eliminating not the mandate and letting the market dictate?
So I think we've seen it in both places where, quite frankly, the legislation has provided cover for elected officials locally around getting projects approved. It's in state law, we have to do it. This is the maximum parking that they need to build, and that's been incredibly helpful. But we've also been a neighborhood where parking is an issue, and trying to figure out that right balance of, is overparking our development going to be the solution, or are there other tools that we can help that neighborhood utilize to deal with the parking issue in their neighborhood? So I think I think having a parking minimum actually helps us in most cases.
John Adams, Gensler, one of the best, one of the biggest architecture firms, managing partner. How do you take all this in, and what do you see as the future?
Well, the pricing of this stuff is really a big barrier. That's what I keep hearing from our clients like Kevin and Brad. The cost of the land is one thing. The cost of construction is another thing, and it's really getting up there. With all the best intentions of measures like JJJ, prevailing wage doesn't necessarily make things less expensive. So we have that, as a headwind to providing more housing. One of the things that we think we're going to see more of, and I'm sorry, I brought visual props because I'm an architect and I can't work without my slides, is modular and prefabricated housing. And there we go. So we're working right now with a group called Citizen M. They do hotels around the world. There's one up in Seattle we're working on. These modules are incredibly, actually, high quality. They're made in Poland at the moment. They're shipped over. That's why they're 9 feet wide, 10 feet tall, maybe 25, 30 feet long. The cost of this, because of at least the speed, is really bringing the pricing down. In addition, if you can actually have larger projects, more than 10, more than 50, more like 100 units, you can really get the pricing of everything way down, not just speed. But just on the speed side, 2 to 3 months out of a year-long construction schedule, these guys will tell you it saves a lot of money. And when it's predictable, you get great quality, it makes a lot of sense.
But again, the certitude of the process is
exactly,
key.
which was already mentioned. So we think that's an exciting thing that we're going to see more of. In a funny way, I think actually the housing industry needs to learn from the hotel industry, because the hotel industry is really who's doing it. Citizen M, Marriott has, yeah, exactly. Moxie by Marriott is all modular, and they're doing them all over California and the rest of the country. So I think, we're going to need to probably draft on the hotel industry to kind of understand the best way to do this.
The talk of, you got the modular up on the board. There's also talk of, in some areas, using old containers,
Right.
Container shipping and things like that. And then I saw some really small 3-story thing that was being done somewhere overseas in, living spaces. Are those just cute little things as opposed to legitimate solutions for any part of the population? Is it worth, plugging those in, or is it a waste of time, do you
No,
think?
I think, they do need a lot of adaptation to actually work.
Yeah.
There's a company down in Wilmington, where all the containers are, that's actually doing that. So I think it's not necessarily as inexpensive as you might imagine because they're already made. They need to be adapted, but we're seeing that happen more and more. And I think if you combine that with in the backyard, the ADUs, right?
Right.
That's something you just kind of plug and play. It would be great. I want one in my backyard because I can do it. There might be a combination of these things. The other nexus that I think is kind of interesting, we have a research program and interns that come in every year, and we had them look at, what are the implications of the driverless car and housing. And if you take modular units, maybe even pre-printed, like with 3D printing units, combine it with parking structures that are already there, and in the future will be pretty much empty in a lot of cases, you can get what you see on the screen now, which is housing in old parking structures. So, you've got that infrastructure, let's use it.
I'm not sure, I saw Kevin shaking his head too. I'm not sure how soon or how empty those things are going to be. There's a lot of studies out now that show that Lyft and Uber actually have increased congestion, not decreased it, because there's more, it's still a car on the road, and there's still another, and then, there's some talk, if I have an automated vehicle, I can send that to go get the groceries, and I'm going to go drive somewhere else. So I think there's a lot of...
And I personally wonder what the streets are going to look
Right.
like. They might be jammed. Some of the math says you won't be able to move around on the streets.
Right.
But I do think that the parking will be obsolete.
I think you may be right on the parking. I just, my concern on, it's a different panel discussion, but, as long as my cell phone keeps dropping calls, I don't want it controlling my car.
Yeah.
So
a whole nother panel.
Yes. We'll do that a different day. Brad, how about you guys? You guys have been in this space a long time, Trammell Crow, obviously one of the bigger companies around, and you get your commitment to LA is well known, and you personally as well as the company, which we all appreciate greatly. What do you say?
Well, I'm going to go into parking. No. When you think about parking is one of those big issues I have in LA. You think about it, the parking studies that have been done, 14% of the land mass in LA is used for parking lots. We have 3.3 parking spaces for every car that's on the lot. If you look at that 14% of land mass, that's 200 square miles of parking, which is 4 times the land mass of San Francisco. So parking, we're way overparked in the city, and as Clyde pointed out this morning in his presentation, if you densify 4% of the city, you've got 14% of it used for parking. You densify 4% of the city, and you densify it around our transit.
Right.
You can solve our housing problems, and if you figure out how you streamline, I'm not sure, Senator, I'd use the term streamline. I look at Los Angeles, it would be improving a very burdensome process. So as Kevin said, LA is a full contact sport for trying to entitle projects, and it's going to continue to be a full contact sport no matter what we put in place at the state level. It's got to be solved here at the local level, and we have taken a lot of steps forward to doing it. So I go into transit. I want to talk a little bit about that because I'm a huge proponent of transit for a couple issues. One, you think about, it's all about jobs. Where are the jobs going in Los Angeles? The jobs are moving around transit because in order to hire employees, they've got to get them to work on time, they've got to keep them at work, and they've got to make them very happy. So, Richard, you stay in your car all the time, as I do, driving around, but think about it, in 2025 in Los Angeles, 3 out of the 5 people working in the workforce are millennials. So the millennials today in Los Angeles, 18 to 24, 61% of them, where are they living? They're living in your house. So when they turn at
What
20,
what percent of millennials do you think
61%,
we're actually going to be
18 to
working?
24.
We're actually going to be working. That was the question.
Three
I
out of
had.
five millennials will be working and out of your house, Richard. So at 2025, and when they move out of that house, what are they going to do? Are they going to buy a car? Or are they going to get an apartment? My belief is they want to move out of the house and get an apartment. They can't afford to have both in the city of Los Angeles and when they move out of the workforce. 41% of the people, 18 to 34, live at home in Los Angeles. So as that workforce moves into the job categories, our jobs are going to be centered around this transit system. And when you look at that transit system,
And by the way, and part of that phenomenon you're talking about, Brad, that goes back to student loan debt and a variety of other factors.
yeah, student loan debt, they're all carrying $100,000 of student loan debt.
Yeah.
So if I go forward, if you look at the transit system, I don't have the slide that shows where it gets built out in the future. This is today's transit. But we're doubling the public transit system in Los Angeles. And those millennials are going to be living, working, and playing at our transit hubs throughout the city. And Clyde did a phenomenal job this morning. If you missed it, look at his presentation of how the city of LA can solve their problems by putting density around the transit centers. We've made that investment. I talk to our investors that come in and say, why should I be invested in LA? It takes you 5 to 7 years to get a project approved. So I tell them a couple things. One, it's LA County is the fourth largest economy in the United States, only behind California, Texas, and New York. I tell them, you look at our population, we're the largest county in the United States. Would be the 11th largest state by population in LA County if we were a standalone state. And we're the most diverse economy, both from the population, from the demographics, and from the job and employment opportunities. So that growth is going to be here, as Darren pointed out in his slides. So for us, we have over 3,000 units that are going around the major transit hubs from Pasadena, 2 projects adjacent to Union Station downtown, 6 in Vermont, Hollywood and Gower next to the Hollywood Station, and then 15 acres at North Hollywood. And our investors come in and say, we love that investment strategy. We have over 3,000 units, of which almost 600 of those will be affordable units. And if you look at the historic investment metrics in Los Angeles, we built over the last 5 years, we got this housing boom, right? No, we don't. We built 6,100 units over the last 5 years, average per unit, per year.
Affordable?
No.
Just across the board?
Across the market, 6,100 total units per year over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nothing when we have a demand of over 500,000 people. And as was pointed out by Doug this morning, we had 140,000 applications for his Section 8 apartments that came available. We have 560,000, I think the statistic came up, of people that are at the gap of being homeless here in Los Angeles. So we need to solve the problem. How do we do that? We take the streamlining with leadership like the Senate has provided the state. We have to have the leadership locally here to densify around all of these transit hubs and look at half-mile solutions, first and last mile solutions. I mean, that's the only way we're going to deliver the housing here, and and the reason we invest here is because the NIMBYism is much less around transit hubs, because you can argue that the millennials and the workforce of the future are going to be living, working, and playing at that transit hub. They're not going to be driving through your neighborhood.
Which is why you see that, that workforce or that housing workspace combination becoming more popular in planning. John, yeah.
Could I build on that a little
Sure.
bit? Again, I have a couple of
Well, you can
prompts
draw it.
that
I don't know
wanted
if you can build it, but you can.
I think to support what Brad is saying, and I've got another couple of slides if someone could pull them up. We actually looked at, through LAGIS, yeah, that slide right there, please. You can go online, LAGIS, and you can find all the underutilized sites around LA. There are thousands that are already zoned for multifamily that are maybe 25, maybe 50% actually utilized in terms of their density. And then you overlay the metro lines and the kind of, call it the quarter mile, 5-minute walk around that, and you get still thousands of sites that are tremendous sort of development and design opportunities. Matchmaking a bit between the public sector and the private sector is one way to help solve that.
It's a great point, because I think the first last mile in LA is a myth. That unless you're talking about affordable, where you're going to build it right on top of a transit hub, in reality, it's first and last 2 to 3 miles in order to get to the transit from wherever the home or the apartment is. And that's part of what makes solving that problem so difficult, is how do you get there? But the idea of using the smaller pieces around transit hubs makes a tremendous amount of sense. Is there any sort of coordinated effort to try and do that at this point, or is it pretty much left to somebody like, Gensler or folks? Darren, you want to help me on this?
Yeah, I would. I think one of the things that the state did several years ago through a bill called SB 375 was link transportation and housing in a way that had never been linked before. And as part of that, as we look out and see what the future transportation system is going to look like, we are identifying what these high-quality transit areas are, what types of development opportunities are available there. And one of the things that we've really been building on that over the last couple years is just the amount of information and data that we have available from the region. And I think, LA County is doing it. We're doing it for a whole region where we basically have parcel-level data for the entire region. And we're opening it up so that developers and others can come in and build apps, can build tools, so they can start to analyze and see where exactly are the opportunities to develop some of these properties, not just for sale properties, as was mentioned, but actual, provides an opportunity to link to the city, to link to the current landowner, and start to think, how do we get some of the densities up? But one of the things I did want to add on too, while it's absolutely an exciting opportunity, when you look at what is actually getting built in those high-quality transit areas, the affordability is not necessarily there. It's not necessarily for the millennials. It's oftentimes for a second home because they're $1,000, $1,500 a square foot type development in these very expensive condominiums, which is a sign that yes, that there's a real desire for people to want to be in these communities. But I think we have to use caution that that's going to be the answer to everything, because right now what is happening in high rises is very, very high end, and that it certainly has a great impact on the rest of the market. There's no doubt about that. But it's not necessarily the affordability numbers that the millennials are going to be afford to rent in their first apartment out of their parents' house too.
Yeah, but they double up. I mean, if you look at the population, think of LA, there's 800,000 multifamily units in LA. Right. 640,000 of those are under rent control. 87% of our inventory that in Los Angeles was built pre-1989. So it's old inventory, and you just don't get the turn of those people that are under rent control. They don't move out. So you have to have alternatives where people can double and triple up in units that are market rate units.
You also you don't get the turnover in any housing that you used to get. Part of that's the Prop 13 effect, and people not wanting the property. I mean, if you've been in that house 15 years, you're not moving because your property tax bill is going through the roof if you do. Robin, you were going to?
So I was going to say, as part of our equitable TLD strategy, and especially along transit, sort of making sure that there's both the preservation of affordable housing and the production of new housing, we had a grant out. I have to give a shout out to Ann from California Community Foundation to look at a number of the lines. And what we found is, yes, there was underutilized land, but mostly it was really built out. And where the opportunities are in terms of preservation and adding on was probably more in the single family housing stock. So this accessory dwelling unit is definitely an opportunity. In the preservation of things that were sort of naturally occurring affordable. And then there were some few opportunities to take not existing zone land, but something that was underutilized, that was perhaps industrial, and rezone it residential. But it's definitely something we've been looking at. It's resulted in a couple of development opportunities.
But we have to be careful, as we've seen in LA, where a lot of industrial's gotten rezoned, and then we wonder why there are no jobs. I mean, it's again, it's all those silos going back and forth in there. Scott, what do you think? Are we going to solve all these problems? Or, I mean, you took a huge step forward.
Yeah. So it took us probably 50 years to get into this mess. San Francisco, which I know best, basically stopped building any kind of significant amount of housing until recently in the early 1960s. And then San Francisco went through downzonings in the 60s and 70s, where you had even some major corridors that were downzoned to 40-foot height limits. I know LA in the 80s went through a mega downzoning. And so, and we've erected just barrier after barrier after barrier. I like to say in California, we over time adopted a housing last policy where every other policy priority took precedent, and if there were crumbs over at the end for a few housing units, then we allowed some housing to be built. And we're trying to flip it to a housing first policy, because housing is fundamental to everything else. But it will take time. So we're looking at legislation, for example, next year about transit hubs. And I'm going to have pitchforks out for me in San Francisco.
Well, this is all off the record, by the way, so it's all right.
It's okay. You know, if you're within a certain distance of a transit hub, you shouldn't be able to have single-family home zoning, period. And, you know, and that's not to say you tear down the single-family homes. Single-family homes are totally, it's fine. But if you have, say, a vacant lot that's a couple blocks away from some major transit hub, you shouldn't be able to force that owner to build a single-family home, when even with the presumptive 40-foot height limit that we have in San Francisco, it's probably similar in LA, you can probably build 3, 4, maybe even 6 units on there. No extra height, no density, you don't even have to get, or bulk, you don't even have to get into that. Just letting people make better use of that. And we see in the Bay Area around a lot of BART stations, Caltrain stations, Muni stations. I'm sure it's the same down here. You know, just single-family homes, as far as the eye can see, even if it's a couple blocks from this huge investment. And so we have to have those conversations about the zoning. Now, it will not change overnight. We're not going to solve this in a year or 5 years. We have existing development there. It's not like you're going to tear everything down. We're talking about over time, the transformation happening. And so people, it's hard as an elected official. This is why, until recently, a lot of elected officials didn't really want to take on housing, because it's not like, you know, okay, we're going to do this, and then in 2 years, it's going to be resolved.
You mean like water?
Right. But it's hard as an elected official when you say, you know, I know this is disrupting your life right now because it's like cranes everywhere in construction. I know you're getting evicted right now. I know your kid is trying to move back from college, but can't. I know you just had your second child and you can't deal with a one-bedroom apartment and you're thinking of leaving the state because you can't afford. I know that you're like in crisis right now, but trust me, if we just keep doing this, in 5, 10 years, it's going to be easier, maybe 15 years. But that's the reality, that it's going to take time. And my concern is that these are hard votes, for whether it's local or state. These are hard votes. And to ask legislators and council members year after year to basically, you know, piss off a lot of people by taking aggressive votes on housing, when people say, wait, you told me you cast that vote to fix housing, and now here we are, and the rent's still high, and I'm still getting evicted. And so we just have to stay focused in the long term, which is so hard to do in politics.
Okay. Darren, you want to add? Then
Yeah, I
get
just
back
wanted
Kevin.
to build on that too, to help discuss. Certainly, it's great that this organization is hosting this event today with such a focus on it. Next week, SCAG is hosting an economic summit focused on housing affordability and what are we going to do about our housing crisis. And we're going to have, you know, 100 and 150 local elected officials there, some other business representatives in the room talking about solutions. But if that urgency from the business community, not just from the developers and not just from the engineers, isn't there, it's going to be hard to give that support to the legislature. And I say that because one of the things we really want to focus on our conference is a discussion on the impacts of the employers. Because the reality is, if there isn't adequate housing stock, a little bit was discussed first thing in the morning today, it's impossible to recruit talented people, to retain them. If there's people that are commuting 3 hours a day across the region because they can't afford to live closer to their home, they're not going to be productive when they get to the office. They're going to want to be anxious to leave the office at the end of the day. We have a panel that we've been working on setting up this on top of a group of economists and later with a group of solution. And we can't get, we've had a terrible time getting businesses to come share this story. We wanted to have Snapchat there to talk about what they've had to do. They're like, no, that's not something we want to talk about publicly. We had another big car maker that is moving from you know, Torrance to Plano. I think you all know who that is. Certainly part of that decision was how they don't have, they can't pay their workers to live in a quality life because they're commuting longer and longer distance. So I say that because There's no way at the local level that the local elected officials are going to be successful, and at the state level, if it isn't the business community and the employers aren't standing up and talking about what this really means to them and what the impact is.
Kevin, you've been suspiciously quiet for a while.
I think everyone's got all the right answers. I don't need to say what they've already said. No, look, I think that the housing, we're very active now in San Francisco, more so than down here. And, for a long time, we looked at the statistic of 60,000 people a day leaving the city on buses, going down to the peninsula to get their jobs, and then coming back because they all wanted to live in San Francisco. But they're living in San Francisco, 3, 4, 5 to a 1 or 2 bedroom because they have to double, triple, quadruple up in order to afford it. Right. But they want the vibrancy of the city. Right? So now you see the office, the jobs coming into the city, companies that usually leave San Francisco staying in the city, but now the housing is so bloody expensive and there's more people and less housing per person, the dynamics are crazy. So Oakland starts to grow like crazy, right? The peninsula starts to grow like crazy. Google starts to say, I'm gonna build employee housing on my campus, because then I get them to work, 26 hours a day, because they're everywhere they go, they're still working for me, right? They get their haircut, their laundry, their volleyball, everything's right there. So it's a win-win for them, and the economics are pushing them into that. So
Robin, I'm sorry, Kevin. I didn't mean.
No, it's a very complicated.
I want to go back to the comment that the senator was making. So in my lifetime of doing this work, which has been a long time now, we got 15 bills passed this year around housing, which is pretty amazing. We haven't had that done in a long time. Money for the production of affordable housing for low-income people, streamlining incentives or hammers to get local government to do work. And that's incredibly amazing. And I've heard stories of what it took to get some of the state legislatures to actually say yes, including chasing people down on the balcony. Not this one.
We're not going to talk about those stories today in particular.
No, but it's incredible. As I was preparing for this, I looked up something, was trying to do some research, and California needs to produce, I think, like 184,000 units a year just to deal with population growth. All of this package of legislation, I think, will produce about 14,000 units a year. Right. So it's so much work that we need to do in order to get this done, and it's about money, and it's about land use, and it's about NIMBYism. So great job, and we still have a whole lot to do. And we still all grieve the days of the loss of redevelopment, but that was a major tool for getting both affordable housing produced, but getting market rate housing produced. Right. That included affordable housing. And I think having that type of statewide solution is really, really important. So maybe that could be on the agenda for next year.
I'm going to go quickly to Brad, then to Scott, and then.
Well, I applaud Metro and I applaud the County of Los Angeles. They've been very aggressive in P3 partnerships. So they are taking the approach that we need to have the private sector really execute the housing in order to meet the housing needs, rather than trying to deliver that under the public sector. It's one of the issues we have. Then talking about the linkage fee, it's again the LA solution is let's tax the private sector more and take that into, in addition to the other money that we have coming in through the bond issues, right. And then we're going to implement housing. They've never been successful. They've been successful under the Housing Trust Fund in executing and delivering affordable housing, but you have to figure out a way to provide the incentives to the private sector to deliver that affordable housing as part of the overall component of market rate, and the county and Metro are leading that effort very successfully.
Senator?
Yeah, so first of all, in terms of what Robin was saying, it's interesting. When it comes to affordable housing funding, you can calculate pretty well how many units it's going to produce because you generally know what the costs are and so forth. When it comes to other reforms, it's hard to say how many it's going to produce. Because when you talk about whether it's streamlining or the strengthening the Housing Accountability Act, because we see all the time that it's zoned for 50 units, and when it comes out of the process, it's all of a sudden at 20 units. And so these, I think over time, I'm not guaranteeing it, but we could see significant yields just as we shift the culture of how housing is approved in California. And we just start seeing overall more housing, bigger projects, denser projects. I don't want to Deezy and I participated in this, being a little bit negative about, because we're in such a deep hole. What gives me hope, and I talked at the beginning about the flipping of the politics on this, and I think that is not a short-term thing. I think it's in the governor's race now. I don't know if housing has ever been in a governor's race before. And part of it is it's the general population, but we now also have housing activists. A long time we had housing activists. It was two types. It was people who advocated for subsidized affordable housing, which is fantastic and important, and people who advocated for tenants, and people who advocated to stop housing. Like, there was not a lot of overall global, just housing of all types kind of activism. And we now have that, the YIMBYs, the SMI backyard activists, it's the YIMBY party in San Francisco. Down here, it's Abundant Housing LA. It's East Bay Forward. And they're popping up, like in Sausalito now has a YIMBY chapter, which in Marin County, not easy to build housing there. Right. And so we have, not just young people, but a lot of young people, these millennials who are the most impacted, who are asking, what is my future? And they are showing up at hearings and they're organizing. I was at their big event in San Francisco last night. Hundreds of people were there. We have a growing army that is pro-housing, and I think that can give us some momentum, because to me, my view is that in terms of housing in California, for so long, we had this approach, it's pure local, a few random state laws here and there that weren't enforced. It's pure local. Everyone gets to decide for themselves if they want housing. If so, what is it going to be? Is it going to be for what income levels? Are they going to keep poor people out? And I think we're going through a period of adjustment. And I view housing now in California, it should be more like public education. We have local school boards that are elected. A lot of local decisions are made about schools. But it's not the Wild West. The state sets parameters around public education, and within those parameters, you have local control. That's what housing needs to be. The state sets the parameters, and within those parameters, you have your local control.
No, Scott, thank you. I think we've identified a lot of the problems. We've identified a number of solutions. We have the senator to thank for SB 35, which is a huge leap forward. I think the challenge for all of us and everybody in this room goes back to what you were saying, and a couple of the stories that were told. I remember Measure R preceded Measure M in 2008, and for transportation, I remember a woman coming up to Mayor Villaraigosa at that point about 2 months after and asked if the subway was built yet. And it was like, it's 2 months up, but that's part of what that problem, telling that constituent in 5 years, 10 years, it's gonna be better, they're gonna, yeah, and that's gonna do me what? But we've gotta somehow bridge that acceleration that we feel today. It's, it's sort of like we're in this, I would imagine this is what it felt like in the Industrial Revolution, when there was that kind of massive change. And change happens so quickly today between the electronic revolution and Twitter and communications. I will sometimes long for the days when I could say, no, the fax never showed up. Mailman didn't deliver it, it just, but we're, so, that speed that everything's traveling at now runs contrary to be able to say we're moving forward. So it does take leadership, and we salute and appreciate, Scott, what you did. And the other thing it's going to take for all of us in the room is to give elected officials the support they need so that they take tough stands and take on tough issues. Way too often, we wonder, why is nobody leading? It's because we've been throwing rocks at them for 30 years. Why doesn't middle management take more risks? Because they've been told they get fired. We've got to encourage people to take risks again if we're going to solve some of these problems. And a key component of that, Scott, for an example, is doing his part. We all have to do the part of supporting the folks who are willing to take the risks to encourage more people to take those risks if we're ever going to solve these problems.
And if I could just say, the LA delegation, particularly the city delegation, was really just fantastic. And particularly there are some great leaders down there. Senator De Leon, our pro tem, and Speaker Rendon were just rock solid. Richard Bloom, Ben Allen. We have just some amazing leaders down here. And sometimes on many, many issues, we as elected officials, you get lobbied. Please do this, please do this. Mm-hmm. It's important to thank people also, because they're getting all the arrows thrown at them now for supporting some of these bills. Just when you see them or you want to send them a message, just thank you for doing this.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. So panel, thank you all very much. And We're now going to the next portion of the program, which I believe is lunch and honoring some leadership.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join us for lunch and a very special key.